So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here in this community. And also thanks to Gabriel's presentation, because it introduced a bit the complexity that we try to deal with in our work and in this presentation. So what we had, so I'm Simone D'Alessandro, I'm professor of economics at the University of Pisa, and with me there is also Pietro Guarnieri, that so is working in the same university. And so what we are trying to do is to put together different challenges that we think are important today. So the first one is the ecological transformations of our society. The second one is the interaction with the economy and the social variables like inequality, and not only inequalities in many different respects. And I will try to show you what we are able to take into account. And finally, we understood that probably if we want to understand what is a sustainable society in general, we have to put into account other variables that are not like monetary or economically clear, like well-being in many different respects. I will try to explain you what we plan to do, let's say, that sort of preliminary results. So just to clarify a bit the framework that we have in the last period. So we are taking a sort as given the fact that we have to do this kind of ecological transformation or sustainable transformation of our society. That, of course, is very important for well-being. I hope that I have not to convince you of that. The problem that we have in mind is that most of the climate or low carbon transition policies that are taken, that are trying to, so that are introduced in today, they seem to have some regressive distributional effects. What does it mean here, regressive distributional effect? It means that from one side, there can be some increase in inequality. From the other side, there can be some just displacement, but also some issue connected to the kind of availability of time that you have, as well as some issue connected to gender gaps. There is a lot of literature trying to understand how these kind of policies can increase some of these issues that we know we try to solve in a transformation of our society. But of course, there is another important connection between the possibility, let's say, that this kind of climate policies are introducing or moving the system in the right direction, and the distributional effect, that the possibility that this kind of change would create some social barriers to the transition, to the transformation itself, or the transition. What does it mean? It means that if there are some regressive outcomes, so like job displacement in particular, but also some issue about time poverty, there can be some behavioral change that are not going on, so people are not adapting, or there is the possibility that there are not the political support to this kind of policies, as we see that is something that this weekend, we will see if this is a part of the discussion. But of course, there is also the possibility that we have some kind of social unrest. We are referring here to social unrest like the Gilets jaunes in France a few years ago, where a small increase in the carbon tax would make people really go on the street and stop this kind of transformation. Indeed, Macron has to come back on the increase, of the carbon tax. So this means that if we want really to make a sort of, to make a transformation that is also can improve the social cohesion of our society, we have really to understand how to solve and to avoid this kind of effects. So what we're thinking mainly is that between this arrow, there are a sort of conditions that matters a lot, where usually there is not much attention. So there are attention on the distributional effects in the literature, but much less on the kind of condition that are a sort of situation that we have today. And if we are not trying to solve them, or we are trying to understand, these kind of mediation factors or conditions are making a risk of creating social barriers to the transformation. So what kind of of condition we think are important? The first are actual inequalities. So we have inequalities in many different respects that seems to make really difficult that some kind of policies could avoid the regressive effect of the policies. There is an issue connected to the time affluence of people. So Gabriel was speaking about working time reduction, but we know that time pressure, it is a very important sort of an issue in many families, and I'll show you some evidence. Of course, there are other conditions, like the availability of social capital, or maybe easier, the availability of the access to basic services that can really mediate between the impact of this kind of policies. So this is a bit what we are trying to do. And of course, as you realize, the complexity, so we are putting together many ingredients, maybe too many. But it's something, the ambition is to have some tools in order to assess policies. Okay, so to understand how we can deal in choosing the right policies to go in this process. So what we have done in the last 5 or 6 years, let's say something like that, we are developing a macro simulation model, an AIM model, based on the scale, on a country scale, in order to, to have a direct link with the, with the government that has really taken these kind of policies. And this model is based on system dynamics, and so sometimes we could say from a post-Keynesian perspective somehow, okay? So this is a bit the model. I don't want to stress you in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I have no time to enter in the details, of course. But there is a sort of input-output structure of the economy that allow us to take into account the effect of jobs and structural change in the economy itself. And we try to make a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the households, both in terms of occupational status. So if you are employed, unemployed, if you are out of the labor force, or maybe, you are retired, for instance, which are the level of the skills that matter. You know that job polarization is a process, or a skill, skill polarization, it's something that matters a lot during this day. And the model is also able to take into account a sort of endogenous technical progress that change the internal coefficient and allow us to have a sort of scenario where the structural change can be done and can be made endogenous to the model itself. Of course, since we are interested in the in the effect also in terms of environmental outcomes, we mainly focus on CO2 emission. That is a big simplification, of course, but allows us to understand how resources matters in this context. So, okay, what we have done, and the first thing that probably is important is to come back to our framework. So if you consider the carbon tax in this kind of context, so what we learn is that the carbon tax is regressive. Also in our model, we show this kind of scenario in which when you introduce the carbon tax, you have a gain in terms of emission, but there is really some issue in terms of inequality or many other important social outcomes. Why this is important? Because we can say, look, if you make a redistribution of the revenues of the carbon tax, maybe you can reduce the regressive impact of the carbon tax in itself, but maybe you are reducing the gain that you have in terms of emission, because the model is a bit demand-led. And so, of course, you are giving money to people that at a certain point they try to consume something more, and so to create new emissions, let's say. There are something that matters a lot. What we think it matters a lot is time affluence. What does it mean? It's the ability of people to adapt, to increase the speed of adaptation to the change, for instance, in the price change, the consumption box. Time is so important. Probably we start this talk with Pietro during the COVID, so we were really in time pressure. So we were saying, look, what happens if we are working on working time reduction? The idea of working time reduction starts from a very simple idea. We know that in our society, this is a European Social Survey in 2 waves in 2004 and 2010, and you see that the people that are working less, they would like to work a bit more. That's not really, shocking, let's say. And on the other side, the people that are declared to work a lot, they would like to work a bit less. So what does it mean? It means that also in terms of well-being, a better redistribution of work through a reduction of working hours could increase the well-being of these people. Okay, could generate some improvement in terms of well-being. But however, how we can make a work time reduction, of course, there can be policies, like in France, someone was commenting before, but it's also possible that we try to think about how increasing productivity, that I told you is endogenous in the model, can be used to reduce the working time. It's a bit strange from, it's not easy to explain in a few minutes, but the idea is this one. Imagine that there is no GDP growth. Honestly, here, GDP growth is endogenous in the model, but forget for a moment. And any increase in productivity, you are reducing a bit the working hours. What happens in the economy? The economy happens something quite simple in the sense that the employment is constant, right? So you are not increasing employment. That is something that usually we say when we speak about working time reduction. On the other side, the cost for the farmer is reducing. This makes the economy a bit more competitive in the international market. And this increases the demand and also the growth of the economy itself. Is everything good? Yes. But of course, we have this problem that emissions are not declining as much as we expect reducing, let's say, the working time. Here, in this view, in this graph here, sorry, I'm going really fast on the scenario, sorry for that. the main issue is that the hourly wage is constant. So we are reducing, so in terms of the discussion that we had before, we are reducing the salary, I mean, of the workers. And so the gain in terms of CO2 emission that are here, so between the scenario that are not much, but are so significant somehow, are lost by the fact that this society, so this economy is becoming more competitive. And so its export will increase again. So, but of course we show somehow that you can think that other countries will do the same. And so this kind of competitive increase is not used, or you can make some fiscal constraint to the public policies. All this scenario allow us to say something that I think is important, that while this kind of working time reduction would increase, I mean, would improve the situation with respect to baseline, they're still maintaining a trade-off between social and environmental variables. Of course, we also try in the paper to look what happens if the wage is constant, and of course, there is a big increase in terms of improve of distribution. I mean, it's not an increase, it's an improvement, I mean, in the reduction in inequality. But of course, the gain in terms of CO2 emission is still reducing, no? Because of course, there is this demand-led economy. But of course, I mean, working time can be reduced also by policies. And of course, time, again, this interaction between time and also the time out of the labor force, of the labor, so I mean, the work, the paid work, let's say, and what happens at home through carry income, or what we call here unpaid work, is really important. So what we do, we use almost the same model to evaluate the two policies together, that are, for one side, the working time reduction, on the other, the universal basic income that someone was mentioning before, in two different ways. From one side is a traditional basic income policies. So we give some money to all, universally, the same. On the other one, we try to make the carry income conditional to the time of this category of people that are spending time in unpaid job, in particular in women. What happens, we try to understand if working time reduction could be a way to redistribute better the jobs, also in unpaid, I mean, in the unpaid side of the economy, but at the same time try to reduce also the time and income gaps of women. We find that this measure could work, but again, there is something that is a sort of shortcoming here, that every time that you think about some policies that are monetary oriented, so I mean, you are giving income to the people, there is this trade-off with the emissions, and at the same time, so that people would consume more, let's say. At the same time, it's not enough to cover the gender income and time gaps in this case. Okay, even if you are making a policy that is really give a lot of money to all these people. So what to do next? This is something, so this will be the result that we have. Now I have to show you the result that we don't have. That is a bit more difficult. So we believe that there is something missing here, that is about well-being. And in particular, the question that we have in mind now, and thanks also to the Wiser project that we are partner of this project, so we are trying to consider in the model, is how to include other variables like social capital, relational goods, the access of public services, and try to understand how the change in some of these variables would affect the economy and maybe also the emissions, so the CO2 emission in terms of an evolution of the system. Why we can do that? Because the model, and now we have a Wiser version, it's quite funny, the Wiser version of the model, Martin, help us in taking into account how households would change the consumption pattern. So it's an issue not about like maybe someone mentioned the defense in consumption hypothesis. So not really in terms of the aggregate level of consumption, but about the composition of the consumption. So between food, transport, cars, whatever it is. And in particular, now we have 100 families, so households, and we know how this kind of family is the region in Italy. That is nice because we have a lot of differences between north and south, but also, I mean, the impact of income in terms of everything, so in the pattern of consumption, but also in terms of emission. So for instance, this group here is the top quantile in Lombardia, that is the richest region in Italy, and we know that per capita the emission produced, so consumption-based emission of this group is much higher than many others, so many others group in the society, let's say. Okay, in order to do so, we have made many changes to the model, and we also work a lot in terms of matching the quantity use of the energy products and the monetary flows of the project, but this is a bit technical, so if you're interested, we can explain. So what to do now with this, let's say nice machine? Okay, the question is this one. Which are the drivers that we are taking into account? We could take into account the model. It's still a model. We cannot do everything, okay? And to grasp some issue about how this transformation of the economy towards sustainability could increase the well-being of all, let's say. Okay, so this is something that we already include in the model. And also we know how this affects the consumption of the households. We're trying to understand is how change in social capital or the access to basic service can change the consumption patterns and the consumption-based emission. It's not an easy, an easy job here, but what we are trying to do is to take, and then of course, when you have the consumption composition, you can get the CO2 emission. Look, before going to a slide of technicalities, we're not really technical, honestly. Here, the point is this one. Imagine that this kind of transformation where we are trying to increase social capital, we are trying to improve public transport, would make a change in the consumption pattern, so in the consumption of people, that maybe goes in some sectors. So then, of course, you have a target for the policy to decarbonize the sector that are increasing, because you know that the sector has to increase well-being. Okay, I don't know if it's clear enough. So this analysis helps us to understand which are the sectors that we expect to increase in this kind of structural change, and so allow us to be more precise about the policies that we can try to set in the model. So we took in the last weeks the data set made by ISTA that is called Multiscopo, and is a survey that is aspect of daily life. We have tons of variables. I would like to thank some of the static people that help us in making this sort of selection, Julia in particular. And we were able to, to identify a few variables that we think are important that we can control somehow in the model. Especially this kind of variables are variables that can be targeted to policies. You can think about policies that can try to increase social relationship. We know that it is not easy, but you can think about at least how a reduction in working hours can maybe increase the possibility of having good social relationship. And at the same time, we have some variables that naturally in the model are connected dynamically to the model itself. So we can see how the dynamics of the model would shape or would change some of these variables. So endogenizing a bit these variables that are strictly connected to well-being in a classical, let's say, macroeconomic model. So this is something that we have to do. We have to do this estimate. Now we have all the elements, so I hope that we can do quite fast. And then, of course, we would like to understand in the model what happens to dynamics. That is the most interesting stuff. So to understand the scenarios and try to keep, also some possibility of the target. So in terms of how policies could really change maybe some of these variables, improving both the condition for well-being, maybe for the socio-economic system, but also for reducing the emissions. So this is a bit what we are doing. So I don't know if I have time, 2 minutes, perfect. So this is a bit what we learn about the defensive consumption hypothesis. The idea is that the economic growth generates some environmental and social impacts. Remember, there is also this part about illness of people that matters a lot for negatively to well-being. And these tend to increase the consumption of people in order to protect themselves from the negative externalities, let's say. But of course, this can have a positive link to well-being. But of course, what we expect in general, that is what Stefano, Bartolini, Francesco, and others has tried to highlight, is that we expect that this substitution is not enough. That we are expecting that this kind of defensive, so that this kind of social impact in particular would make people unhappy. So why this is important? Because this is increase the dependence of our well-being of the income of the people. This is also the reason why, if you remember the Gabriel's graph at the end, so this is one of the possible explanations. I don't want to be. So do you remember when we was looking at the working times, and at the end there was a sort of working time are not decreasing as in the past. So there is a puzzle. Why in our society we are, still continues to grow, why we are becoming a bit richer. And one of the reasons is that our well-being is really much more dependent on income, because we are reducing some, relational goods or social capital, but also some basic goods. So I mean, the access to basic goods. So in Italy, we know, in Italy, in many other countries, we know that there is a sort of privatization of services that were basic services before, and if you want public. So the point then is this one, that is the next step, is to try to understand which policies can somehow increase the relational good and the social capital, and maybe create, so break this vicious cycle and make the opposite vicious cycle, from one side through relational goods, the other through access of basic services. They also in the literature on sustainability, maybe sort of heterodox view to this issue, they are suggesting this kind of I mean, public luxury, let's say, and private frugality. I mean, if you have a lot of basic services that are almost free or free, like public transport in Luxembourg, let's say, of course, people maybe would tend to reduce the spends, I mean, that they have need in order to satisfy a certain need, that is the mobility, for instance, okay? So this is a bit what we are trying to do, and to, I mean, increase maybe the complexity of the model for sure, but also I hope to find some nice, I mean, some nice result. Okay, thank you very much.
Questions? I have maybe a clarifying. Oh, go ahead. You start. What I'm thinking about is, how do we endogenize some of the behavioral change? So maybe you can just give an example to help me understand the model.
Okay. Right. So honestly, it's very difficult for me to define the model that we're working and we build, because on the one hand, it's really a macroeconomic model. On the other one, has all the future of an ABM or an agent-based models, because we have these 100 categories of people that, depending on their consumption patterns or their preferences, to come back to the plenary this morning, would change. So the change in the consumption composition depends if they are working, which is their wage, which if they have financial, income, or whatever it is. That change in time, but it change also for income, okay, for price change, for instance, this affect the share, of the consumption, of this consumption expenditure. So what happens that we are able to follow behavioral change in terms of this share of expenditure in different goods. So for instance, again, if I increase the public transport, I'm expecting that the parameter that for us is the share of consumption expenditure goes to private transports, reduces, while maybe it increases a little the ones on public transport, because maybe I have to pay, it's not so free as it looks in Italy would be a bit impossible, let's say. And this is a bit the idea. So it's able to include, so you are becoming vegetarian. This is something difficult because food is one category, but you can think how much the cost will change. I have a small micro module that allow you to understand which is the impact in terms of the expenditure of people. But I told you that it's quite nice because we have really a lot of difference in terms of regions, so geography, let's say, in space, so that if you see these are different quantiles for different regions. No? So they really change. So this is a CO2 emission. I didn't put the share. But if you see, there are really a lot of change that are not all explained by change in income. So for quantiles, the richest quantile in our region is spending the money very differently from the poorest. So this is the kind of way in which we can introduce some behavior. Okay.
Thanks. This is really important work, and I really like the micro-macro link that you're exploiting. My question, I think, is a bit along the same line. So I was thinking, in this conference, we are talking about, let's say, the impact of social relations on well-being, but you would even be more ambitious. You need also to model the production function of social relations. So how do you think about going about that? So the government spends money, and then how do you think that affects social relations in your model? That I think is
okay. It's not easy to answer to you, but so one of the futures that I really like this approach is that we are able exactly to make this link. So it's a general equilibrium model. So I don't know. We can say many different ways. It's not equilibrium, but it's a general model, at least, let's say. And I would say, so for instance, one interesting question is this one. Imagine that we decide to do for the fossil fuel phase out now. So we know that some sector will shrink, maybe disappears, and people will be jobless. So we lose a lot of jobs. So then we have to think how to regenerate some skills and other expectations, but at the same time, how to redistribute the jobs in the sector that are shrinking, and maybe what people can do with the leisure time. So of course, we cannot really go inside and see, okay, what are you doing? But however, we have some statistics, so we can try to measure a bit. For instance, in terms of unpaid jobs and leisure, we made with the macro data, you can understand if you reduce 1 hour working time, how much leisure you gain. Because it's not that the hour becoming an hour leisure, maybe you're doing some unpaid work and you're substituting the unpaid work. So we can look at some behavior. Of course, what is difficult is to understand one of the questions that rise here. So what are you doing with your leisure time? You're doing to make friendship, or you're going home and see the TV. What my feeling, and this is the theory that we try to introduce here, that is an assumption, I mean, is that of course this depends on this social capital, the amount of free time of the others, and inequality in this kind of variables. So I think this is the way in which we are proceeding. So scenario approach is also helpful to compare some assumptions to see what happens. But of course, in terms of policy, I mean, policy implication, policy suggestion, one thing that I hope to be able to say is that, look, if you're increasing the social capital, you're making nice places like the park here people maybe will go. If you have a piano in the park, maybe people will join it. So of course, I have no way to test, but we can assume it and see what happens. So this is a bit the way in which we are doing this scenario analysis that I know is not enough, but I mean, it can be something.